So Hellblade is a game I loved the original. I thought it was groundbreaking in a lot of ways. It was really novel and interesting how they handled the discussion over her mental illness and tied that into gameplay as well. It was fascinating how they handled it. It was from a smaller team. It was a game that kind of came out of nowhere and was just really high production value. Super, super cool. And I loved the original Hellblade, even if it had faults, which it did. Combat in it was terrible. The puzzles were pretty bland and boring after the first hour or two. The game was super short. Some people reported getting through it in like 5 hours. Others, it took more like 7. And there was a lot of walking and a lot of just slowly moving through like a very tight track to the next area. Still, I think worth playing, especially on Game Pass and stuff, but it had problems, even if the rest of it was pretty good. The sequel has been in the works at this point for 7 years. 7 years, okay? To be clear, as we mentioned on the podcast today, that is enough time from the time that they launched Batman Arkham Asylum to the time that they launched like Arkham Knight. That's like less than 7 years for Rocksteady. Like that's how much time we're talking about here. Okay, like this is an immense amount of time. That's like enough time for other studios like Santa Monica Studios to get both God of War and God of War Ragnarok out the door. It's the same amount of time for Insomniac to get like Spider-Man and Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart and Spider-Man Miles Morales and Spider-Man 2 out the door. Like this is a lot of time is what we're trying to communicate, okay? Like it's almost enough time to develop Starfield. Exactly, almost. So there's a lot of time at play here. And what's been revealed has been sort of a mixed bag, unfortunately. The initial trailers that they dropped were very interesting, showed that this was going to be a very high fidelity game. And some of the stuff that we saw was crazy epic. So like there's this sequence that they opened up with the cave and this giant that comes out of the water. And this was one trailer that I thought was fantastic. I thought this really showed that this was going to be a super high production value cinematic experience. And there's just some crazy epic stuff that happens. Like this is just freaking cool. It's trippy as all hell, but super, super cool. Just see him crawling out of the water. I don't understand what's happening. I don't know I don't know if this is somebody we're supposed to care about or hate. I don't know why they're trying to hunt him, but it's epic. It's epic. I think God of War Ragnarok also spoiled me because I see this now and I'm like, yeah, it looks like a video game. And yeah, it's a big set piece, but I've seen bigger. But like God of War Ragnarok, I think did that because when I first saw this trailer years and years ago, I remember just being like, oh my God, how is this running on hardware? Like, how is this actually running in real time? It's baffling to me. You know, it shows how far we've come. Yeah, this is running in real time. This, at least at the time it was running on a build of the game. And it's crazy. Looks absolutely fantastic. One thing you also need to know is that this is a game that runs with the letterboxing effect, kind of like the Order 1886 did, which will save resolution. So they don't have to render all of these pixels up here, and that gives them a little bit of a trick to give higher fidelity because they don't have to physically render as much. So you think like, ooh, rendering 4K is so intensive. It's true. But if you render 4K minus all of the space saved by using the black bars, you save a lot of rendering power, and you can put that into other things. But you can see that it's a super epic game. It's super intense, and this is cool. This, well, I don't think you can make an entire game of just this because there's very little interaction. The player is probably holding down the left stick in these sequences when you're running forward, and then maybe pulling the right trigger to like throw the spear and stuff. But broadly, this is on like train tracks. Okay, it's like this is very, very linear, but it's super epic at the same time. But there still has to be a video game at the core. So as the years have gone by, we've seen more trailers. They had this trailer at, let's see, this was June 11th of 2023. So this was last summer. And I thought that this trailer, while it probably is reflective of what you do in the game, I thought this trailer was kind of a waste of time, because it's a lot of very slow walking, and then there's this kind of cutscene with the really trippy effect. What do they call that? A mandala or something like that. Really, really trippy and feels like, you know, you're on acid, but this plays out and it's just the camera slowly moving around her while some dialogue plays out. And then she goes down into the water, into the puddle, and then like talks into the puddle and talks to her reflection. And then the trailer is over as she sinks in the water. Really weird trailer. I don't really know how useful that was. It didn't really communicate much of anything about the world or the story or the gameplay or anything. So I thought that trailer was largely, unfortunately, a waste of time. And I'm saying that as a fan. I just didn't understand what the point of all of that was. But we got a broader look now at what is actually going to be in the game. And it also is not that helpful. So we saw some more clips. We saw some more like footage of what appears to be gameplay. So just like the first game, there's a lot of walking through corridors as dialogue plays out. That's fine if the story is good enough. That's cool. There's these sequences they showed a few times of her being tackled by these like monster zombie looking creatures. We of course have Melina Jorgens, who was originally, fun fact, the video editor for the studio. And then she stepped in and did some of the motion capture for Senua until they found an actress to do it. And then they were like, you're actually really good at this. So then she just became the actress for Senua and the face scan model and everything. And now that's what she does. I think she still edits videos for them, but super cool. They show some more dialogue and stuff like that. And then some more walking. And then some combat with Senua slashing and hacking and stuff. And if you didn't play the original game, it's important for you to understand that the combat in the first game was very button mashy. It was like mash, 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 dodge, mash, 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 parry, mash, 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 dodge. And that was basically it. It was very, very underwhelming, but it was kind of saved because the rest of the game was pretty good. And the game wasn't very long. So by the time you got sick of the combat, the game was basically over. Now in this, they say at the very start that they've revamped all of combat, okay? For one, I find it strange that discussing the opening of the combat section, they have the VFX director talking, not the gameplay director. I don't even know if they have a gameplay director, but it's weird that they aren't doing that.
She's in her own unique way and battling through encounters with enemies that will push Senua to her limits.
Okay, battling. So for this, it's important to ask yourself, what's the question they're trying to answer, right? The question is, how is the combat in this game or the gameplay in this game better than in the last game? Because that was the common complaint. That was the biggest frustration people had with the game, was the combat.
On Saga, we've taken everything to the next level.
Okay.
With a new motion capture space, a bigger stage team, a stunt crew, and a new cast.
We spent a lot of
That's good for like narrative stuff, not necessarily for combat, but okay.
time planning the motion capture shoots, thinking of what events would be good to bring into this fight. Like, how can we make this fight feel different from the previous fight?
Okay.
We have all new combat for the sequel.
All new combat. Awesome. What's it like?
One of our key goals was the ability to actually tell a story throughout it. It does feel very different from the first game.
It feels very different from the first game. How?
It's very brutal and you're very invested in it.
It's brutal and you're invested. How?
Senua isn't a superhero. She's fighting for survival, and we want the player to feel her struggle in every step of her journey.
I feel like that's not an answer to the question, but okay.
We want the player to always feel like they just scraped through, just survived it.
We want you to feel like you barely survived the combat because it feels very different and is intense and brutal. How?
Mel knows Senua better than anyone.
And then they just go into discussion over Senua. Did you see what they did? So they're talking about how these things are different, but then they don't show it. They don't explain it. And it could be that it is actually very, very different. And that it actually is way improved. And it really does feel like you barely scrape by in a really cool way. But they need to show that. They need to communicate that. And just asserting it is not sufficient to do that. Because guess what? A lot of studios, a lot of devs will say that their game is, they think, Game of the Year material. And guess what? It's not. A lot of people think that X game is fantastic and that, oh, well, our gameplay in this is amazing. And it's not. When I went to that Avatar preview event, I spoke to the gameplay director and I asked him what gameplay system is going to define Avatar. What game system do you want players to know about and know to focus on that's going to make this game really click? He said the cooking system. And the cooking system is the system that commonly people complain about the most in Avatar because it's so underbaked. See what I did there? It's just not great. Okay. So to be completely clear, I think it's possible everything they're saying is true, but they need to show it and justify it. And it would have been very easy just showing now there's all of these different combos that you can do. There's different weapon types. There's different swords that can be equipped. There's things like you could go through that, or maybe there's not stuff like that. And instead it's just like, you know, with different enemy archetypes and different enemies fighting in different styles, players have to change their approach. And some enemies will swarm you. Others are very powerful single encounters, and you have to approach each one differently because they each require a different strategy for taking down. Just say something like that. Something like that. And that's more than we got. That would be at least an explanation of how maybe it's different or how it works and how it's good and why it's good. But we haven't gotten anything like that. Instead, they just assert it and then move on. And whenever I've seen studios and marketing teams just blindly assert something and then move on, it's usually because they're trying to just quickly glance over it. It's like when Todd Howard says Starfield's technology is amazing and it's the most impressive game, technologically speaking, that we've ever made. And then he moves on very quickly. Very, very quickly. Oh, we think like the most hilarious thing about this was when Todd was asked in that Xbox, I think it was a Kind of Funny Games actually. Kind of Funny Games did like a sort of interview. It was basically a puff piece kind of thing where they sat down with him. Was it Kind of Funny Games? I don't remember who it was. Paris was there. But they did this interview where instead of asking like some really hard-hitting questions, they kind of just gave him layups the whole time. And then when they finally did ask a question, I think it was from chat or from the community or something, and they asked him, like, what about vehicles to traverse on-planet surfaces? And Todd was just like, there are not vehicles in the game, but when you're using your boost pack or you know, jet pack, it feels really, really cool to go on these low gravity planets. And then they just moved on. And it was like he couldn't even come up with anything to say, you know? It was just like, it feels cool to bounce. And that was the whole explanation. Why aren't there vehicles, sir? Because bouncing's fun. That was basically the answer. This is the whole thing. So I'm always a little concerned when something is asserted blindly and not discussed beyond that, and people just shift. You know, they just shift. Could be the case that everything they're saying is true, but if it was true, why didn't they just show how it was true? You know, makes you wonder. So that's one of the reasons something about the game is just like a little bit off and just makes me feel a little weird. They show discussions of spatial audio and the music, and that all is great and was great in the first game. So I have no doubt that it will be great here. And then the other stuff they show is just more dev interviews and stuff, and then a release date of May 21st. But all told, again, like the questions we had about the game have not only have they not been answered, but it seems like they're going to great lengths to avoid answering it. And everybody that talks about this and Hellblade in general is frustrated by the combat, by the puzzles. They accuse it of just being a walking simulator, basically, and that the game was really short. They didn't directly address any of those other than saying that this game is shorter, and that's kind of it. And afterwards, they said that the game is roughly the same length as the last one, which again was only about 7 hours for most people. For some people, even less than that. So after 7 years, they've only gotten 7 hours. As Joel Raptor said in the podcast, each year they've been working on this game, they've been able to add an hour of content. For 7 years. Now, maybe the production value is so crazy high that they have earned that count, and it's going to be 7 hours that's so crazy, epic, and amazing visually and auditorily and everything that it's going to earn that, and it's going to be worth playing because of that. Maybe it's possible, but I don't think we've seen enough to really show that. That first encounter with the giant coming out of the water, I was like, okay, that probably took a while. And so if we have that type of encounter nonstop for like 7 hours of gameplay, okay, that's a fair trade-off. I get it. I understand. And it's a smaller team. I get it now. But that's not what we're seeing. The more we see of the game, like is stuff like this. It's stuff like this of her walking just walking. And it could be that this is just what's between each of those epic encounters, and they don't want to spoil the whole game, so they're just not going to show it. But you have to wonder. You have to wonder when they don't actively acknowledge those frustrations and concerns people have. You have to wonder why. Is it possible that they just honestly don't know that people are frustrated by the combat, and people were frustrated by the short length and by the walking simulator allegations? Is it possible that they honestly have never heard of those? I don't think so. Because no matter what, no matter where you look, if somebody asks about Hellblade, that's what comes up. And the fact that they reference the combat, saying it's very different from the first game, that suggests there was something wrong with the combat in the first game. So they've taken steps to improve it or change it, but they won't show how. And it's weird because this game is coming out very soon. And this was a platform for them to do that. Again, it would have taken 2 or 3 sentences to just explain, oh, each of these combat encounters is altered and we want each of them to feel like you barely survive, as they said. But we do that because each enemy type requires a different approach for Senua, or maybe you have different weapons that you can use, or maybe different attack sequences or combos work differently with different enemies, things like that. Just explain however your combat system works, explain why it's better than it was before. But they didn't do that. They just didn't. Yeah, they have 120 developers at Ninja Theory with contractors additionally, I'm sure, doing some outside outsourced help on the game. I'm sure they have a decently sized team all told. But for 7 years, 120 developers, I would think, would be able to get more than 7 hours of stuff out the door. But it's not always about length, boys. Remember that. Not always about length. It's about the quality of the length. And in this case, I hope the quality is super, super high. But we shall see. We shall see. I'm just shocked at all this because after playing Senua's Sacrifice, I was sure that this was like a new player up there with Naughty Dog, like with a big budget. These guys are going to blow everybody away. And instead, after 7 years, they seem to basically just be doing Hellblade 1.5 from what we've seen so far. And I'm frustrated by that. Still probably a great game for Game Pass. Still probably worth getting. Again, with it being shorter and on Game Pass, you can't really complain about the price not being fair because you can just download it. But it feels like, you know, what have you been doing for 7 years? You know, that I can't help but wonder that because it's very, very strange. Do you think COVID played a part in how long it took to make? Absolutely. Like with a cinematic game like this that requires a lot of motion capture stuff, absolutely, that delayed things. But they're based in the UK, I believe. If you say that this took them, like COVID lockdowns added, let's just say they basically didn't do any work for a year, which is very generous. I think that like they still have gameplay teams working and level designers working from home, but let's be really generous and say that a year of progress was basically lost. I don't know if that's accurate, but even then, 6 years for basically a 1.5. So I'm confused as to what they've been working on all this time, with this being the final result and what they have to show for it. So I'm not, I'm shockingly underwhelmed. I was not expecting to feel underwhelmed, but I am. Last thing I almost forgot to talk about with regard to Hellblade 2. They also announced that it's going to be digital only, and the deluxe, like digital deluxe, whatever, it's going to be $50. And that's when they announced that it was going to be about the same size and length as the first game. So $50 for about 7 hours, Game Pass, it's included, and no physical launch either. There's a lot of physical only or physical preservation activists, let's say, that are very frustrated by this. And I totally get it. It's another game that's only having a digital release. Unfortunately, this is just the new normal. This is where we are. Like every game is going to be doing this, especially on Game Pass. If it's launching on Game Pass first and foremost, there's just not much reason to put all the effort into a physical launch. I'm somebody that loves my physical media. You can see all down here, all my physical media. I'm the guy that still buys Blu-rays, okay? Because the quality is way better. I actually own the film. The audio specifically is way better than streamed audio. It's not even close. So I love me some physical media, but unfortunately, the industry and the consumers have just decided they would rather digital stuff. So this is just where it's going, unfortunately. I don't like it, but it's just how it's going. The only way it changes is if masses of people come in and refuse to buy the digital stuff and only buy physical versions of games. And let's just be honest, There's not many people that are going to boycott Hellblade because of the digital only release. There's just not. So it just is what it is, unfortunately.